The sun was a relentless, white-hot coin in the vast Montana sky. It baked the earth below, turning the ground into a cracked, dusty puzzle. This was the Badlands, a place of stark beauty and silence, where the wind was the only thing that ever seemed to speak. In the middle of this great emptiness, a small group of people moved slowly, their backs bent against the heat. They were a paleontology team, led by a man named Dr. Aris Thorne. Aris was in his late 40s with a face that was tanned and lined from years of working under this same sun. His hands, though strong, were gentle, with dirt permanently etched under his fingernails. For 3 long weeks they had been out here. 3 weeks of waking up at dawn, pulling on heavy boots and walking for miles under the big sky. 3 weeks of carefully scanning the ground, hoping to see a shape, a color, a texture that was different from the millions of ordinary stones. And for 3 weeks they had found almost nothing. A few small bone fragments, pieces so tiny they told no real story. It was frustrating, and a quiet sense of disappointment had begun to settle over the team like the dust on their clothes. Aris wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm. He looked out at the landscape, a place he loved deeply, but which could feel like a stubborn, silent friend. He was starting to worry. The university was funding this dig and they needed results. More than that, he needed it. He had a feeling about this particular spot, a hunch born from looking at old maps and geological surveys. But hunches don't dig up fossils. Hard work does. He watched his team. There was Sarah, a young graduate student who was so passionate and bright. She had joined his team straight from university, her head full of theories and dreams of discovery. Now, after weeks of finding nothing, he could see the dream fading from her eyes, replaced by a tired determination. He felt responsible for that. He wanted to give her that aha moment, the one that every paleontologist lives for. Sarah was working a few yards away on a dry, crumbling slope. She was on her knees using a small, soft-bristled brush to sweep away the loose dirt. It was tedious work. You sweep, you look, you sweep a little more. Your mind starts to wander. You think about the cold drink waiting back at camp or the shade of your tent. As she brushed, her tool hit something that wasn't just dirt. It wasn't the usual swish-swish sound. It was more of a tap. She stopped and leaned closer, her shadow falling over the spot. She brushed more carefully now, her movements slow and precise. The object wasn't a round, smooth river stone. It had a strange pitted texture like a honeycomb, and a dull grayish-brown color that was different from the reddish earth around it. Her heart gave a little jump, but she told herself to be calm. It could be nothing. A weird-shaped rock. They'd been fooled before, but something about this felt different, Dr. Thorne. She called out, her voice cutting through the quiet. Could you come take a look at this? Aris, who had been studying a map, looked up. He heard the slight tremor of excitement in her voice, carefully controlled. He walked over, his boots crunching on the gravel. He knelt down beside her, his knees popping in protest. What have you got, Sarah? I'm not sure, she said, pointing. It feels different. Aris pulled a small hand lens from his pocket and leaned in close. The world shrank to that one spot of earth. He saw the texture she was talking about. It wasn't the solid crystalline structure of a rock. This was complex, organic. He took a small dental pick from his tool belt and gently, ever so gently, scraped a tiny bit of the surrounding matrix away. The shape became clearer. It was a curve. A solid, unbroken curve. He looked up at Sarah, and for the first time in weeks, a real, genuine smile broke through his tired expression. It wasn't a big, celebratory grin, but a slow, dawning look of pure wonder. Sarah, he said, his voice low and almost a whisper. This isn't a rock. He moved the pick again, revealing a little more. The curve connected to another and another. It was a piece of something larger, something much larger. Look at this structure, he said, his finger hovering just above the fossil. This is cancellous bone. Internal structure. This is from the inside of a large bone near a joint. The rest of the team had noticed the change in atmosphere and were gathering around now. The air, which a moment before had been heavy with heat and fatigue, was now crackling with a new energy. Aris sat back on his heels, looking from the bone fragment to Sarah's hopeful, excited face. He felt that old electric thrill coursing through him, the one that had drawn him to this work in the first place. It was the thrill of a connection, a bridge across millions of years. This is it, he said, his voice firm now, filled with a new confidence. This is what we've been looking for. We need to flag this entire area. We're going to work slowly, carefully. We're not just digging up a bone. We're starting a conversation with something that hasn't spoken in a very, very long time. He looked back at the exposed fragment, a small, silent witness to an ancient world. The long, fruitless weeks were forgotten. The hunt was over. The discovery had just begun. And in his mind, Eris was already starting to listen, trying to hear the first whispers of a ghost in the stone. The mood at the dig site had transformed completely. The tired silence was gone, replaced by a quiet, focused hum of activity. The team moved with a new sense of purpose, their earlier disappointment forgotten like yesterday's dust storm. That one small, strange-looking piece of bone had changed everything. Dr. Eris Thorne stood over the spot, directing the work with a calm intensity. "We'll start with brushes," he instructed, his voice low but clear. "Only brushes. No picks, not until we know the full extent. Sarah, you're on point. This is your find." Sarah felt a surge of pride and nervousness. She nodded, selecting her softest brush. The responsibility was huge. One wrong move, too much pressure, and a million-year-old clue could turn to dust. She got back on her knees, the hard ground suddenly feeling like holy ground. The process was achingly slow. It was like trying to uncover a precious photograph that had been buried in sand. Without scratching it, she would sweep away a small patch of dirt, then stop looking at the exposed surface. She would then use a small puff of air from a squeeze bulb to clear the fine particles. It was a dance of patience, brush, look, puff. Brush, look, puff. Eris worked beside her, his own movements just as gentle. He was like a surgeon, his full attention on the patient in the earth. He wasn't just digging. He was reading the soil. "See this color change here?" he said to Sarah, pointing to a slightly darker band of sediment. "That often indicates a different layer, a different time. It can help us understand how the creature was buried." Hours passed. The sun climbed higher and the heat became a physical weight. But no one complained. Someone brought over a large umbrella to shade the work area. Another team member passed around bottles of warm water. They were a team again, united by a shared goal. Then Sarah's brush revealed something new. A few inches away from the first bone fragment, she uncovered another texture. It was smoother, flatter. "Eris," she said, her voice tight with excitement. "I've got another one." Eris moved over to look. He used his own brush to carefully clear a wider area. The flat piece was connected to the first one. It wasn't just a random fragment. It was part of a larger structure. As they worked outward, more and more of the shape was revealed. It was a massive curved blade of bone like a huge petrified scythe. "My God," Eris whispered almost to himself. "That's a scapula, a shoulder blade." The sheer size of it was staggering. This was no small creature. This was something monumental. The team gathered around, their eyes wide. The quiet oohs and ahs were not from a fireworks display, but from the slow unveiling of a giant. The work continued for the rest of the day and into the next. They marked out a large grid around the find with string and small pins. Every handful of dirt that was removed was not just thrown away. It was collected in buckets and carefully sifted through fine screens. They were looking for tiny treasures, a single tooth, a piece of a smaller animal, a fossilized plant seed, anything that could tell the story of this ancient world. By the end of the third day, they had uncovered the outline of a huge skeleton. There was the long, graceful curve of the spine, the massive bowl of the pelvis, and the long, powerful-looking leg bones. It was lying on its side, as if it had just lain down for a nap millions of years ago. Eris stood at the edge of the excavation pit, his hands on his hips. The setting sun painted the Badlands in shades of orange and purple. He looked down at the ghostly white shape emerging from the red earth. It was a hadrosaur, a duck-billed dinosaur. He was sure of it, but the size and the unique large crest on the skull they were just beginning to uncover suggested it might be a new species. That night, back at camp, the atmosphere was celebratory. The team sat around a crackling campfire eating their simple meal of stew and bread. But the conversation was not about the food. It was about the dinosaur. "What do you think its life was like?" Sarah asked, staring into the flames. Eris poked the fire with a stick, sending a shower of sparks into the dark sky. "Well," he began, "it was a plant eater. A gentle giant, probably. It would have spent its days grazing on ferns and cycads. In a world that was lush and green, not dry and dusty like this, it might have lived in a herd for protection." He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to picture it. It would have been loud, he said, a smile touching his lips. Not roars like in the movies, but deep rumbling calls to communicate with the herd. The ground would have shaken when a group of them walked by. He opened his eyes and looked at the eager faces around him. That thing we uncovered today, he said. It wasn't just a collection of bones. It was a living, breathing creature. It felt the sun on its back. It felt rain. It knew fear and perhaps comfort. Our job isn't just to dig it up. Our job is to remember that, to listen to the story it's trying to tell us. Later, when the others had gone to their tents, Eris stayed by the dying fire. He pulled out his field notebook. Under the light of his headlamp, he didn't just write down measurements and observations. On a fresh page, he started to sketch. It wasn't a scientific drawing of bones. It was a rough, simple drawing of the animal as he imagined it in life, standing by a river, its head raised, its powerful body alive and moving. He was a scientist, trained to deal in facts and evidence. But he knew that the real magic happened in the space between the facts. It happened in the imagination. The bones were the words, but the story was what they would all have to build together. And as he looked at his simple drawing, he felt the first, faint whisper of that story beginning to stir. The Montana dig was over. The precious bones, each one carefully wrapped in a plaster jacket like a fragile patient in a cast, had been loaded onto trucks and made the long journey back to the city. Now they were in the heart of the museum's preparation lab, a place that smelled of glue, plaster, and old stone. For Dr. Eris Thorne, this was where the real work began. Digging up the bones was an adventure, but here in the lab, under the bright, steady lights, was where the true conversation started. The main skeleton of the hadrosaur, which they had nicknamed Daisy as a placeholder, was laid out on a series of large, sturdy tables. The room was filled with the gentle, constant sounds of preparation. The soft tap, tap, tap of a small hammer and chisel, the low whir of an air scribe that vibrated dirt away, and the scratch of a fine needle under a magnifying lamp. Eris spent most of his days here. He would put on his safety glasses and lose himself for hours. His world shrank to the single bone in front of him. With a dental pick and a brush, he would patiently pick away the last bits of hard rock, the matrix that clung to the fossil. It was a painstaking puzzle with no picture on the box. One evening, long after the rest of the lab staff had gone home, Eris was alone with Daisy. The overhead lights were off, and only the bright beam of his desk lamp illuminated the massive skull, which was now almost completely free of rock. He wasn't working anymore. He was just looking. He traced the line of the jaw with his eyes, imagining the powerful muscles that once attached there. He studied the complex hollow crest on top of the skull, a structure that scientists believed might have been used for making sounds or for display. In the quiet of the lab, it was easy to forget this was a collection of minerals that had replaced bone. In the silence, it felt like a presence. This was the ghost in the stone. This was what he had told Sarah about at the campfire. The fossil was the physical evidence, the hard fact. But the animal, the living, breathing creature, was the ghost that haunted those facts. It was his job, as a paleontologist, to listen for it. He reached out and gently placed his fingertips on the cool, smooth surface of the skull. It wasn't a scientific act. It was a human one. He closed his eyes. He tried to push his imagination back through the millions of years. He didn't see a skeleton. He tried to see skin, maybe a mottled pattern of browns and greens stretched over this massive bone structure. He tried to hear the sound it might have made, a deep, resonant bellow echoing through a prehistoric forest. He tried to feel the weight of it, the sheer, immense life force of a creature that weighed several tons. "What were you?" he whispered into the quiet room. "How did you walk? Did you run? Were you slow and careful? Or could you move with surprising speed when a predator came?" He opened his eyes and looked at the empty eye socket. It was the most haunting part. It was a window into nothingness. What kind of intelligence was behind those eyes? Was it a simple instinct-driven creature? Or did it have some form of awareness of social connection with its herd? His thoughts were interrupted by the squeak of a trolley wheel. Ben, the head of the museum's exhibits department, came in, his footsteps echoing in the large space. "Eris, still here? I thought I saw the light on," Ben said, his voice cheerful and practical. He was a man who thought in budgets and deadlines. He looked at the skeleton with appreciation, but it was the appreciation of a project manager. "She's coming along beautifully. The board is thrilled. We need to start thinking about the exhibit. We need an artist. A big, impressive mural to bring this to life for the public. Eris nodded slowly. He knew this was necessary. People needed more than bones. They needed a story. But the idea of an artist, someone from the outside coming in and painting his ghost, made him feel strangely protective. We need the best, Ben continued. We're thinking of hiring Elena Vance. You know her work? Eris did. Elena Vance was famous. Her wildlife paintings weren't just accurate. They were filled with emotion and drama. You could almost feel the heat of the African savanna or the chill of the Arctic in her work. She was brilliant. But was she right for this? The next day, Elena Vance arrived at the lab. She was a woman with sharp, observant eyes and hands that seemed restless, always moving. She carried a large sketchbook under her arm. She didn't gush over the skeleton. She walked around it slowly, silently, her head tilted. Eris approached her, feeling a little like a father introducing his child to a strict teacher. "This is her," he said. Elena nodded, her eyes fixed on the pelvis bone. "The scale is incredible," she said. Her voice was quiet, thoughtful. "But it's so silent." That word struck Eris. Silent. It was exactly what he had been fighting against. Elena turned to him. "Dr. Thorne, your reports are fascinating. The bone structure, the muscle attachment points, the pollen samples from the site. It's great data. But data doesn't breathe. I need to know what this animal felt like." Eris blinked. This was not what he expected. He was used to talking about science. "Tell me," she said, pointing to the leg bones. "When it took a step, was it a heavy, clumsy thud? Or was it a smooth, powerful roll like an elephant? Tell me about the skin. Your report says pebbled, but was it dry? Was it wet? Did mud stick to its legs when it walked through a swamp?" She walked over to the skull and looked directly into the empty eye socket. And the eyes. What was its world like? Was it a world of constant danger, where every shadow could be a predator? Or was it a peaceful grazer, mostly safe in its herd? Eris was taken aback. No one had ever asked him questions like this. They were questions of feeling, of experience. They were the questions he asked himself in the quiet of the lab. He looked from Elena's intense face to the silent skeleton. And then he started to talk. He didn't talk about scapulas and femurs. He talked about his ghost. He shared his campfire ideas about the rumbling calls and the shaking ground. He talked about the lush green world so different from the dust where they found her. As he spoke, he saw a change in Elena's face. The critical sharpness softened into focus. She was no longer just looking at the bones. She was starting to see the animal he saw. She opened her sketchbook. She didn't start drawing the skeleton. With a piece of charcoal, she made a few swift, strong lines on the paper. It was the rough shape of a powerful thigh, a curve of a back. It was alive. Eris felt a strange sensation. It wasn't protectiveness anymore. It was a spark of connection. This artist wasn't going to just paint a picture. She was going to help him give his ghost a voice. The conversation was no longer just between him and the stone. A new, vital voice had just joined in. Elena Vance's studio was a world away from the quiet, sterile museum lab. It was a large, open space on the top floor of an old brick building, flooded with light from a huge north-facing window. The air smelled of turpentine, oil paint, and the dusty scent of charcoal. Canvases of all sizes leaned against the walls, some blank, some with half-finished landscapes or animal studies. It was a place of controlled chaos, a testament to the messy, beautiful process of creation. In the center of the room stood the giant, terrifying object that was her current project, a blank canvas over 20 feet wide and 10 feet tall. It was primed a stark, brilliant white. To anyone else, it might have looked like a simple wall. To Elena, it was a universe of possibilities, and it was utterly intimidating. She stood before it now, a cup of cooling coffee in her hand, feeling a familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. The meeting with Dr. Thorne had been inspiring. His passion was real, and his words had painted vivid pictures in her mind. But now, alone in her studio, those pictures felt distant. The scientific data, the pages of notes on bone structure, the maps of the dig site, the small bag of crushed rock and fossilized pollen Eris had given her, lay scattered on a table nearby. They were just facts on paper. They had no color, no life, no breath. She picked up a piece of the crushed rock from Montana, rolling the gritty fragments between her fingers. This was the ground the dinosaur walked on. This dry red dust was once mud, once soil. She closed her eyes trying to feel it, but all she felt was the anxiety of the blank canvas staring back at her. The first mark is always the hardest, she muttered to herself. She put down her coffee and picked up a stick of charcoal. Its blackness was a shocking contrast to the white canvas. She raised her hand, poised to sketch the outline of the skeleton as she remembered it from the lab. But her hand froze. It felt wrong. That would just be copying. It wouldn't be seeing. She lowered her hand, frustrated. She walked over to her speakers and put on some music. Not with words, just soft ambient sounds of a forest with birdsong and the whisper of wind through leaves. She needed to set the mood, to build a world in her head before she could put it on the canvas. She went back to Aris's notes. He had written about the pollen samples. They showed ancient conifer trees, ferns, and cycads, so it wasn't a dry, barren place. It was a forest, probably near a river. She imagined the light. It wouldn't be the harsh overhead light of the Montana Badlands where the bones were found. It would be dappled light, filtering down through a dense canopy of strange prehistoric trees. The air would be humid, thick with moisture. She picked up the charcoal again. This time she didn't think about bones. She thought about the world. With a few swift, sweeping strokes she blocked in the background. She drew the tall, slender shapes of ancient trees. She sketched in a suggestion of dense ferns on the forest floor. She didn't draw any details. It was just a setting, a stage. Now for the dinosaur. She remembered Aris's words. It wasn't a collection of bones. It was a living, breathing creature. She closed her eyes again, trying to forget the skeleton. She tried to imagine the weight of it, the immense solid bulk of its body. She thought of the elephants she had sketched at the zoo, how their skin hung in heavy folds, how their every step was deliberate and powerful. She opened her eyes and looked at the white space in the center of her stage. She didn't draw an outline. Instead, she started with the feet. She drew two massive, column-like legs, planted firmly in the soft, wet earth of her imagined forest. She made them thick and powerful, believing Aris's theory that it was a strong, robust animal. Then she moved upward. She sketched the great, rounded bulk of the body. She didn't draw a line for the spine. She drew the volume of the belly, the deep chest. She imagined the skin stretching over this massive frame. Would it be tight, or would it have loose folds like some large animals do? She decided on tight, but textured, and she used the side of her charcoal to shade in the powerful muscles of the haunches and shoulders. She stood back, her hands and forearms now smudged with black. The creature on the canvas was just a ghostly charcoal shadow, a rough shape without a head or a tail. But it had weight. It had presence. It was no longer a skeleton. It was a body occupying a space. Her heart was beating faster now, not with anxiety, but with excitement. The barrier was broken. The conversation had begun, not with Aris, but with the painting itself. The canvas was no longer silent. It was asking her questions. What happened next? Was the dinosaur standing still? Was it walking? Was it reaching for a branch? She looked at the powerful legs planted so firmly. It felt like a moment of pause, a moment of awareness. Perhaps it had just heard a sound in the forest. Perhaps it was listening. She picked up her charcoal again and walked right up to the canvas. She needed to give it a head. She needed to give it direction. She sketched a strong, graceful neck rising from the body. At the end of it, she drew the distinctive duck-billed shape of the mouth, and above it, the beginning of the hollow crest. It was still just a rough sketch, a framework. But for the first time, Elena could see it. She could see the animal not as a fossil, but as a living being in its own world. The science from Aris had given her the facts, the blueprint, but her imagination, sparked by his passion, was starting to pour life into it. She didn't know how she would paint the skin, or the eyes, or the light. Those were problems for another day. For now, the most important thing had happened. The first stroke was made. The blank canvas was gone. In its place was the beginning of a window into a lost world. The first flush of excitement had passed. The charcoal sketch on the massive canvas was a promising start, a ghost of the creature that was slowly coming to life. But now Elena faced the real work, turning that ghost into a living, breathing animal. This was where the easy inspiration ended and the difficult, detailed collaboration began. Dr. Aris Thorne visited her studio for the first time since she had started painting. He brought with him the clean, scientific smell of the museum, a contrast to the earthy smells of paint and turpentine. He stood before the canvas, his hands in his pockets, and for a long time he was silent. Elena watched him, her stomach a tight knot. She wasn't used to showing unfinished work, especially to someone who knew the subject better than anyone else in the world. "It's big," he said finally, which made Elena let out a small nervous laugh. "It has to be," she replied. "It needs to feel overwhelming, like you're standing right next to it." Eris stepped closer, his scientist's eyes scanning the details. He pointed to the dinosaur's back leg, the one Elena had painted with powerful rounded muscles. "The femur attachment here," he began, his tone thoughtful but firm. "The bone structure suggests the muscles were positioned a bit differently. It would have given the leg a more upright posture, I think. Less like a rhinoceros, more like, well, like a giant bird." He pulled out a folded diagram from his folder, showing detailed drawings of the hip and leg bones with arrows indicating muscle groups. Elena leaned in to look. She saw what he meant. But in her mind's eye, the change he suggested made the animal look stiffer, almost mechanical. "I understand the bone," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But for the animal to move with any grace, to carry that immense weight, the muscles had to be massive and fluid. Look at an elephant's leg. It's a column, but it has a curve, a power to it. If I make it too straight, it will look like a statue, not a living creature." This was their first argument of details. It wasn't angry, but it was intense. Two experts, looking at the same problem from completely different worlds. Eris saw the hard evidence of the skeleton. Elena saw the soft, living body that had to move and survive in a real world. A few days later, the debate moved to the skin. Elena had started painting a base layer of a dull, grayish green. "Color is a guess, of course," Eris admitted, standing beside her as she mixed paints on her palette. "But we can make an educated one. Look at modern large animals that live in forests. They're often darker on top and lighter underneath. It's called countershading. It helps them blend in." Elena nodded, adding some darker green to her mix. "So a darker back, a lighter belly. But what about texture?" She showed him a close-up study she had done, giving the skin a rough, pebbled texture like a football. Eris studied it. "That's likely accurate. But what about the crest?" He pointed to the elaborate structure on the dinosaur's head. "That might have been for display. Maybe it was a different color, brighter, maybe even patterned like some bird crests today." Elena frowned. "But if it was a prey animal, wouldn't a bright, colorful head make it an easy target for predators?" "Not necessarily," Eris countered, getting animated. "Display structures are for communication within the species, to attract mates, to signal to the herd. The risk might have been worth the reward." They went back and forth like this for weeks. The shape of the beak-like mouth, the position of the tail, did it drag on the ground or was it held high? Each detail was a negotiation between the truth of the bone and the truth of the flesh. One afternoon, the argument was about the environment. Elena had painted a dense, dark, almost swampy forest. "The pollen samples show conifers and ferns," Eris said, "but the soil composition suggests a more open area, maybe a floodplain near a river. It might have been sunnier, with patches of open space." Elena put down her brush, a little frustrated. "Eris, I'm trying to create a mood. A dark, enclosed forest makes the dinosaur feel more majestic, more dramatic when you see it. An open field is, well, it's just an animal in a field. But it might be the truth," he said gently. "And my job is to make the truth feel alive," she replied. They stood in silence for a moment, the tension hanging in the air. Then Eris sighed and ran a hand through his hair. He looked from Elena's determined face to the painting, which was already more vibrant and real than any reconstruction he'd ever seen. "You're right," he said, surprising her. "My job is to tell you what the pieces are. Your job is to show people what they meant." It was a turning point. The arguments didn't stop, but they changed. They were no longer a scientist versus an artist. They became a scientist and an artist, working together to solve the same puzzle. They were two translators, one speaking the language of bones, the other speaking the language of life, both trying to translate the story of a single, ancient creature. Elena started to see the beauty in Eris's precise diagrams. He began to appreciate the emotional power of Elena's color choices and lighting. He would bring her research papers on modern animal locomotion, and she would show him paintings by old masters to demonstrate how light can define a form. The creature on the canvas was no longer just Elena's vision or just Eris's data. It was becoming something new. It was a fusion of fact and feeling, of evidence and emotion. With every debate, every compromise, and every shared moment of understanding, the ghost in the stone took another step out of the past and into the light. Elena Vance stood back from the giant canvas, her body aching with a tiredness that was also a kind of joy. The world she and Eris had built was breathtaking. The prehistoric forest was a tapestry of deep greens and golds, with sunlight filtering through the canopy in soft, dusty beams. The river in the background sparkled. The ferns and cycads looked real enough to touch, and the dinosaur itself was a masterpiece of texture and color. Its skin was a complex pattern of greens and browns, with a lighter, creamy underbelly, just as Eris had suggested. The powerful muscles of its legs and shoulders were defined with careful shadows and highlights, making it look solid and heavy. The distinctive crest on its head had a subtle reddish pattern, a compromise between Iris's theory of display and Elena's need for realism. But something was wrong. Elena had been avoiding it for days, working on the background trees, on the details of the ferns, on the reflection in the water. But she could avoid it no longer. The problem was the eye. She had painted it a flat, glossy black. It was accurate for many reptiles. It was scientifically safe, but it was dead. Every time she looked at the painting, her gaze was drawn to that eye, and every time the connection broke. The animal, in all its magnificent living detail, was just a very well-painted statue. The eye had no soul. It had no story. It was a black hole sucking the life out of the entire scene. She tried everything. She added a tiny white speck of light, a reflection. It helped a little, but it still looked like glass. She tried painting it a dark brown. It just looked like a muddy hole. Frustration began to curdle in her stomach. The exhibit opening was in just 1 week. The museum director was already sending excited emails. Eris was thrilled with her progress. But she knew it wasn't finished. If the eye wasn't right, the whole project was a failure. She put down her brushes and left the studio. The bright, noisy city felt like an assault on her senses. She needed to see life. Real life. She went to the city zoo. She didn't go to see the reptiles. She walked straight to the elephant enclosure. A massive female African elephant was standing near the fence, her slow, wise eyes taking in the visitors. Elena stood and watched. The elephant's eye was dark, but it wasn't flat. It was deep liquid. It held a universe of patience, of memory, of a calm, powerful intelligence. You could look into that eye and know without a doubt that there was someone in there. She then went to the gorilla habitat. A large silverback sat peacefully observing his family. His eyes were brown and gentle, but they held a fierce, protective awareness. He was not just an animal. He was a father, a leader. Finally, she visited the rhinoceros. Its small, deep-set eye seemed to hold an ancient primal knowledge. It was a creature from another time, just like her dinosaur, yet its eye was fully, vitally present. It hit her then. She had been painting the dinosaur as a thing, a subject. But Eris was right all along. It was a living being. It wasn't a monster or a robot. It was an animal. It experienced its world. It felt hunger, thirst, fear, the comfort of its herd, the warmth of the sun. Its eye was the window to all of that. The science could tell her the shape of the eye socket, but it couldn't tell her what was behind it. That was her job. That was where she had to leap from the facts into the truth. She hurried back to her studio, her heart pounding with a new purpose. She didn't even take off her jacket. She went straight to her palette and started mixing paints, not with the careful deliberation of before, but with a wild, intuitive energy. She wasn't mixing greens and browns for skin. She was mixing deep umbers, rich siennas, and a touch of warm black. She picked up her smallest, finest brush. She climbed the ladder until she was level with the dinosaur's massive head. She took a deep, steadying breath. She didn't paint over the old eye. She started fresh, defining the moist, rounded shape of the eyeball itself, making it look wet and reflective. Then she began on the iris. She didn't make it a solid, dead black. She made it a very, very dark brown, and she painted in tiny, subtle flecks of a lighter amber, like light catching in a deep pool. She gave it a soft, intelligent focus, as if the dinosaur had just heard a twig snap in the forest and was turning its attention, its mind processing the sound. She painted the surrounding skin with a few delicate wrinkles, to show that this was a face that could express even in small ways. She added a faint, wet highlight, not a stark white dot, but a soft gleam that suggested a film of moisture. She worked for over an hour on that single eye. Her entire world narrowed to a circle less than an inch wide. Finally, she put down her brush. Her hand was cramping. She slowly climbed down the ladder, her legs shaky. She didn't want to look. She was afraid. She turned and faced the mural, and the dinosaur looked back. It was no longer a painting. The eye held her. It was calm, aware, and deeply ancient. There was a mind behind it now. There was a presence in the forest. The animal was no longer just occupying space. It was experiencing it. The connection was made. Elena sat down heavily on a stool, a wave of emotion washing over her. It was a feeling of profound relief and awe. She had done it. She had given Eris's ghost not just a body but a soul. The conversation with the past was now complete. The dinosaur was finally, truly alive. The day of the exhibit opening had arrived. The museum was buzzing with a kind of electric energy. Staff in crisp uniforms hurried through the halls, making last-minute adjustments. The air smelled of floor polish and fresh flowers arranged near the entrance. In the main hall, a large velvet rope blocked the entrance to the new wing, behind which a crowd of important guests, journalists and donors, was beginning to gather, their voices a low, excited hum. Dr. Eris Thorne stood in his office, trying to tie his tie. His fingers, usually so steady and precise with fossil bones, felt thick and clumsy. He gave up with a sigh, leaving the tie slightly crooked. He was nervous in a way he hadn't been since his first major academic presentation. This was different. This wasn't just presenting data to colleagues. This was like introducing a child to the world. He walked down the polished corridor towards the new exhibit hall, his dress shoes echoing. He could hear the voice of the museum director, a cheerful man named Ben, addressing the crowd on the other side of the wall. And so, after years of meticulous work, from the badlands of Montana to the skilled hands of our preparators, we are thrilled to present Hadrosaurus thornensis. There was a round of applause. Eris took a deep breath and rounded the corner. Ben saw him and gestured him forward. And here is the man who made it all possible, our lead paleontologist, Dr. Eris Thorne. Eris smiled nervously at the crowd, offering a small wave. But his eyes weren't really on them. They were drawn past them into the newly unveiled hall. The hall was dimly lit, with spotlights strategically placed to create a sense of drama. And there, in the very center, standing on a raised platform, was the skeleton. His skeleton, Daisy. The bones were a clean off-white under the lights. Every rib, every vertebra perfectly positioned. It was magnificent. It was everything science could ask for, the hard, undeniable evidence of a life lived millions of years ago. But to the left of the skeleton, covering the entire vast wall, was Elena's mural. Eris had seen it in progress. He had argued over its details, but he had not seen it finished. He had not seen it with the final living eye. The crowd was already gasping, moving like a single organism towards the painting. They were pointing, their cameras flashing. But Eris felt like the world had slowed down. He walked forward, his nervousness forgotten, his focus narrowing to that wall. The skeleton was a collection of parts, a magnificent, beautiful collection, but still just parts. The mural was the whole. It was the flesh on the bones, the breath in the lungs, the light in the world. He saw the dinosaur standing in the dappled sunlight of the forest, its skin mottled and textured, looking tough and real. He saw the powerful muscles in its legs, the way its weight settled into the soft earth. He saw the subtle, intelligent pattern on its crest. It was more than he had ever imagined. It was more alive than any dream. And then his gaze met the eye. It was like a physical shock. A jolt that went straight through him. The eye was deep, calm, and held a profound, ancient knowing. It wasn't the blank stare of a lizard or the roaring monster of a movie. It was the eye of a creature that belonged in that world, a creature that had a life, a history. In that moment, the bones next to it were no longer just a skeleton. They were the proof, and the painting was the truth. The two together told a complete story. He wasn't just looking at a fossil and a picture. He was looking through a window into the Cretaceous period. He felt a presence beside him. It was Elena. She was wearing a simple black dress, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She wasn't looking at the painting or the crowd. She was looking at him, her face a mask of quiet anxiety. "What do you think?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Eris didn't answer right away. He couldn't find the words. He turned from the dinosaur's living gaze to look at the artist who had given it life. He saw the long hours in her studio, the paint smudges on her clothes, the fierce arguments over muscle structure, the moment of breakthrough with the eye. He saw the passion and the dedication that had gone into every single brushstroke. He looked back at the mural, then at the skeleton, and then back at Elena. His eyes were glistening with a sheen of moisture he didn't try to hide. "Elena," he said, his voice thick with emotion. It's her. That's the ghost. That's the animal I was trying to hear." A slow, relieved smile spread across Elena's face. It was the only approval she had wanted. Just then, a young boy, no more than 6 years old, wove through the crowd and stopped right in front of the mural. He tilted his head all the way back, his mouth open in a perfect circle of wonder. He pointed a small finger at the dinosaur's face. "Mommy," he said, his voice clear and full of awe. "He looks like he's about to blink." The boy's mother smiled and squeezed his shoulder. Eris and Elena heard it. They looked at each other, and in that shared glance was a universe of understanding. They had done it. They hadn't just built an exhibit. They hadn't just presented a scientific finding. They had built a window. And through that window, a little boy had just seen a living dinosaur. The conversation across millions of years had found its newest and most important listener. The bright lights and loud cheers of the opening night were over. The television cameras had packed up and left. The museum returned to its normal rhythm, a quiet, echoing space filled with the whispers of history. But in the hall named Envisioning with Dinosaurs, the magic had not faded. If anything, it had grown stronger. Months turned into a year, and the exhibit became the heart of the museum. School groups with brightly colored t-shirts trooped through, their voices rising in excited squeals when they entered the hall. Tourists with maps and cameras spent long, quiet moments just staring. It was never just a quick stop. It was a destination. Dr. Eris Thorne's life had changed, but in quiet ways. He was a little more famous now, invited to give more talks. But his favorite thing to do, whenever he had a free hour between meetings or research, was to slip away from his office and sit on the simple wooden bench in the dinosaur hall. He didn't come here as a scientist to check on his work. He came as a man to watch the people. He saw the way a young girl, clutching a stuffed animal, would slowly walk from the skeleton to the mural and back again, her head tilting, her little brain making the connection. He saw the way her eyes would widen as she understood that the white bones were the inside of the beautiful, living creature on the wall. He saw an elderly couple, holding hands, standing silently before the painting. The man pointed at the dinosaur's eye and whispered something to his wife. She nodded, a soft smile on her face. Eris wondered what memory it sparked in them. Perhaps it reminded them of a long-ago trip to see elephants in the wild, or simply the wonder of being young and believing in giants. One afternoon, he watched a group of college art students. They weren't looking at the skeleton at all. They were sitting on the floor, sketchbooks on their knees, trying to capture the light and shadow in Elena's painting. They were learning from her how to give life to a form, how to tell a story without words. This was the silent conversation he had hoped for. It wasn't a conversation with words. It was a conversation of the mind and the heart. The skeleton asked the question, "What was I made of?" It was the hard, factual truth. The mural offered the answer. This is what it felt like to be alive. It was the emotional truth. People would look at the bones and their minds would work, thinking about science, about history, about death and preservation. Then they would look at the mural and their hearts would feeling the warmth of the sun, the density of the forest, the presence of the animal. Eris realized that neither was complete without the other. The skeleton alone was a cold, beautiful mystery. The painting alone was a beautiful fantasy. But put them together and they created a whole truth that was greater than the sum of its parts. It was a bridge between the head and the heart. One day he saw Elena herself in the hall. She was standing off to the side, almost hiding behind a display case, watching a family. A father was lifting his small son onto his shoulder so the boy could get a better look at the dinosaur's face. "The scientist found the bones, right, Dad?" the boy asked. "Yes, he did," the father replied. "And the artist lady painted the picture?" "That's right." The boy was quiet for a moment, thinking hard. "So, they worked together to help us see it." Elena's eyes met Eris's across the hall. She gave him a small, warm smile. That was it. That was the entire purpose of their long, sometimes difficult collaboration, summed up in a child's simple words. They had worked together to help people see. Eris no longer felt the need to protect his ghost. He had shared it with Elena, and together, they had shared it with the world. And the world was talking back. Not with noise, but with that quiet, awed silence that falls when you are in the presence of something truly wonderful. He stood up from his bench to go back to his office. As he walked out, he saw a teenager, a boy with headphones around his neck, just standing there, his gaze fixed on the mural. He wasn't moving. He was just seeing. Eris smiled to himself. The work of the scientist and the artist was done. But the work of the dinosaur, the work of inspiring wonder that would continue forever, the conversation between the past and the present, between evidence and imagination, was now in the hands of everyone who walked through the door. And it was a conversation that would never ever end. Years have a way of passing quietly. The Envisioning with Dinosaurs exhibit was no longer the new, shiny attraction at the museum. The posters announcing its grand opening had long been taken down. The velvet rope was frayed in one spot from thousands of hands touching it. The spotlights on the skeleton needed their bulbs changed now and then, but for the people who came, it had lost none of its power. Dr. Eris Thorne was now in his late 50s. The lines on his face were deeper and there was more gray in his hair. He was often busy with new projects, with teaching students, with writing papers. But the dinosaur hall remained his quiet refuge, a place where he could remember why he had fallen in love with this work in the first place. One Tuesday afternoon, the museum was particularly quiet. The weekend crowds were gone and the echoing halls had a peaceful, almost sleepy feeling. Eris was walking through on his way to a meeting when he decided to take his usual short detour. He entered the hall and saw that there was only one other person there. An elderly man was sitting on the same wooden bench Eris always favored. He had a large, open sketchbook on his lap and a pencil in his hand. He wasn't a student. He had a kind, weathered face and the relaxed posture of someone who had all the time in the world. Eris sat down on the far end of the bench, not wanting to disturb him. He looked at the man's sketchbook. He wasn't just copying Elena's mural. He was drawing his own version. He had captured the dinosaur's powerful body and wise eye perfectly, but he had added something new. Trailing behind the adult dinosaur were two much smaller ones, their necks stretched up curiously, their little legs trying to keep pace with their mother. The man felt Eris's gaze and looked up. He didn't seem annoyed. He smiled, a warm, crinkling smile around his eyes. "It's a wonderful piece, isn't it?" the man said, gesturing with his pencil towards the mural. "It feels so real. It makes you want to add to the story." Eris felt a strange and wonderful feeling wash over him. This was it. This was the final, beautiful step in the journey. It had started with a bone in the ground. It had become a scientific project, then a creative struggle, then a public exhibit, and now it was inspiring new creation in a complete stranger. "It does," Eris agreed, his voice soft. "It makes you wonder about their lives." The man nodded. "Exactly. The painting shows us the animal, but it doesn't tell us the whole story. That's the fun part. We get to imagine the rest." He pointed to the little dinosaurs in his sketch. "I like to think she was a good mother, that she kept them safe." Eris looked from the man's gentle, imaginative drawing to the powerful, silent skeleton, and then to Elena's vibrant, living mural. The circle was complete. The scientist had provided the facts. The artist had provided the life, and now the public was providing the soul. They were taking the story and making it their own. "You know," the man said, closing his sketchbook, "I come here every few months. It never gets old. My wife passed away last year, and this place, it gives me a sense of peace. It reminds me that the world is big and old and full of amazing stories." Eris didn't know what to say. He was deeply moved. His work and Elena's work had become a source of comfort, a companion in grief, a spark for an old man's imagination. It was more than just an educational display. It had become a part of people's lives. "Thank you for telling me that," Eris said sincerely. "It means more than you know." The man stood up, tucking his sketchbook under his arm. "No, thank you," he said. "To the people who built this, they didn't just put up bones in a picture. They built a place for dreams." He gave a little nod and walked slowly out of the hall, leaving Eris alone with the dinosaur. Eris sat there for a long time. He thought about the long, hot days at the dig site. He thought about the arguments with Elena in her studio. He thought about the nervous excitement of the opening night. All of that effort, all of that passion, had led to this single, quiet moment. a moment where their creation had comforted a lonely heart and sparked a gentle, beautiful idea. He realized that the legacy of their work wasn't in the scientific papers he had published, or the awards the exhibit might have won. The true legacy was in that old man's sketchbook. It was in the mind of the little boy who thought the dinosaur might blink. It was in the quiet wonder on the faces of the thousands of people who had passed through this hall. They had not just resurrected a dinosaur. They had built a space where imagination could live and grow. The work was done, but the envisioning, he realized with a profound sense of peace, would continue forever. And that was the most beautiful discovery of all. The story of the dinosaur, from a single bone to a beloved exhibit, had become a quiet legend in the museum. Dr. Eris Thorne had told the story many times, to journalists, to students, to donors, but the telling of it always felt a little like reading from a book. It was a memory, a thing of the past. One bright autumn afternoon, a new chapter was written, not by him but by a young woman he had never met. Eris was in his office, surrounded by maps and papers for a new dig site, when his phone buzzed. It was Ben from the front desk. "Eris, there's a young lady here to see you." "A Sarah Jensen?" "She says she was on your dig team in Montana, a long time ago." The name sent a pleasant jolt through his memory. Sarah, the eager graduate student with the sharp eyes and the soft brush. "Send her up, Ben, please." A few minutes later, there was a knock on his door. The woman who entered was familiar, but the years had shaped her. The youthful eagerness was now a calm confidence. She was no longer a student. She was a colleague, Dr. Thorne, she said, smiling warmly. "Sarah," Eris stood up, shaking her hand. "Please, it's just Eris now." "Look at you. What are you doing these days?" "I'm a paleontologist with the State Geological Survey," she said, her pride evident. "But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because of this." She held up a small framed photograph. Eris gestured for her to sit. His curiosity piqued. She handed him the photograph. It was a picture of a little girl no more than 7 years old, standing in front of the Envisioning with Dinosaurs mural. The girl was wearing a yellow raincoat and was pointing at the dinosaur with one hand, while the other clutched a toy dinosaur. Her face was a perfect picture of awe. "That's my daughter, Lily," Sarah said, her voice softening. "That was taken on her 7th birthday. It was all she wanted to do. Not go to a theme park, not have a big party. She wanted to see Dr. Eris's dinosaur." Eris felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at the little girl's face, lost in the world he and Elena had created. Sarah continued. "That day in the car on the way home, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, 'Mommy, when I grow up, I want to find a dinosaur for a little girl just like you did.'" She looked at Eris, her eyes shining. "That dig in Montana? It wasn't just about finding a new species for me. It was about learning from you. It was about learning that science isn't just about facts in a book. It's about stories. It's about listening to the ghosts in the stone. You showed me that, and now I'm trying to show my daughter." Eris was silent. He looked from Sarah's face, now a mature scientist and a mother, to the photograph of her inspired daughter. He saw the unbroken chain. He had passed the torch to Sarah all those years ago, and now, without even knowing it, she was passing it to her own child. The legacy wasn't just in the exhibit. It wasn't just in the old man's sketchbook. It was living and breathing in the next generation. The wonder he had felt as a young man kneeling in the dirt was the same wonder he saw in little Lily's eyes in that photograph. "Would you like to see her?" Sarah asked. "Lily is downstairs. She's 10 now. She begged me to bring her." A few minutes later, Eris was walking into the dinosaur hall, and there she was, a taller version of the girl in the photo, standing in the exact same spot. She wasn't pointing anymore. She was just looking, her head tilted, studying the mural with a serious, thoughtful expression. Sarah went and stood beside her. "Lily, this is Dr. Thorne, the man I told you about." Lily turned and her eyes widened. She looked from Iris to the skeleton and back again. "You found her?" she asked, her voice full of reverence. "We did," Eris said, kneeling down so he was at her eye level, just as he had done with her mother at the dig site so long ago. "A whole team of us. Your mom was one of the first to see her." Lily looked at her mother with new admiration. Then she turned back to the dinosaur. "I like her eye," she said simply. "It looks kind," Eris smiled. "I think so too," he stood up. "And the three of them, The seasoned scientist, the established geologist, and the young dreamer stood together in a comfortable silence, looking at the creature that had brought them all together. The journey that had begun with a tap of a brush in the Montana Badlands had come to its final, beautiful resting place. It wasn't in a display case or on a painted wall. It was in the heart of a child, sparking a dream that would likely stretch far into the future. The work was done. The story was told. But the envisioning, he knew, would never, ever end.